Will the world's supply of oil continue to flow out of the Gulf? Donald Trump issues an ultimatum to importers: stop Iranian shipments by November or face US sanctions. Iran hits back by vowing to block the Strait of Hormuz. As the rhetoric heats up over crude, what's the cost? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. Donald Trump's nuclear reaction is threatening to turn off the taps in the world's major oil supply. The White House is threatening countries which import Iranian oil to stop shipments by November or face US sanctions. If that happens, the Iranians are vowing to stop all oil exports from the Gulf, including from the #1 supplier, Saudi Arabia. Foreign ministers from France, Germany, Britain, China and Russia are expected to meet Iranian diplomats on Friday. In Vienna, they'll be discussing how to salvage the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which Trump withdrew from 2 months ago. More now from Al Jazeera's Alan Fisher in Washington.
The Iranian president has been on a 2-day visit to Switzerland. One of the main topics of conversation, the US decision to violate the Iran nuclear deal by pulling out. Now the US wants countries to boycott Iranian oil as part of stronger international sanctions. But President Hassan Rouhani has appeared to threaten oil exports from other Middle Eastern countries if the US pushes ahead.
It is incorrect and unwise to imagine that someday all producer countries will be able to export their surplus oil, and Iran will not be able to export its oil.
Iranian officials have threatened to disrupt oil shipments in the past. To do so, they would target the Straits of Hormuz. That's a major shipping lane. But it's also a small stretch of water between Iran to the north and Oman on the Arabian Peninsula to the south. At its narrowest point, there are just 55 kilometres between the two pieces of land. 20% of the world's oil passes through here.
I don't think Iran will ever need to really exercise this threat. We have to remember Iran is not the only country that is upset with US pressure on OPEC or the idea of the oil exports not coming from Iran. Remember, the OPEC countries, the whole reason a lot of these countries are in crises in the first place is because of the US shale oil industry, which brought prices down in the first place.
The US has previously warned countries they must stop all imports from November or face sanctions from America. No exceptions.
Our focus is on getting as many countries importing Iranian crude down to zero as soon as possible. We are also working with oil market participants, including producers and consumers, to ensure market stability.
Iran has warned any boycott of their oil industry could push prices higher. It currently provides around 2% of global supply, or 3 million barrels a day. The US is already concerned about rising prices. At the weekend, US President Donald Trump called Saudi Arabia's King Salman and said they'd agreed the Saudis would boost production. But there's no sign that prices are dropping, particularly as the global economy is growing and demand for energy is up. India, South Korea, Turkey, all US allies are major importers of Iranian oil. They might not be able to switch providers quickly or even want to. The Trump administration would then have to decide if sanctions on them would follow. The other signatories to the nuclear deal say they still support it and are looking at ways to save it. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's bring in our guests for today. Joining us now from London is Mamdouh Salameh, expert in the economics and geopolitics of oil and energy and author of Over a Barrel. From Tehran, Hamid Mousavi, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Tehran. And also in London, Sami Hamdi, whom you saw just a few moments ago in Alan Fisher's report. He's a Middle East analyst and editor of International Interest. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Sami, is Iran's threat to shut the Strait of Hormuz an empty one?
I think it is an empty one because I don't think that Iran is at a stage where it needs to implement such a threat. Also, let's remember that Iran made strong threats if US was to pull out from the nuclear deal. And then after the US pulled out, it said it would wait to see what the EU decides to do. So I don't think we should take this threat particularly seriously. The reason why I say that is Iran is not at a stage to implement this threat is because it has other options, and it also has allies. It has allies within OPEC. Many of the OPEC countries are happy with the high oil prices. They don't want the prices to come down. And let's remember the impact of the low oil price period on some of these OPEC countries. Venezuela went spiraling into political and economic turmoil. Nigeria doesn't want lower oil prices. Neither do any of these OPEC countries. It means more profits, more revenues to deal with domestic issues. Also, let's look at the EU dynamic. Now, the EU sees that Trump has imposed tariffs on them. They're happy to see Trump suffering from the pinch to his own domestic economy caused by the high oil prices. Let's remember that Trump is going to be facing midterm elections. And as a result of the high oil prices, petrol prices are going up in certain areas of his key electorate, in those Midwestern areas. That's why he's particularly keen on bringing the oil price down. Even for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the two countries who are really pushing the Trump agenda to try to bring the oil price down a bit lower, the only reason they're doing so is because they're following a policy of appeasement to Washington. They have the reserves to survive a lowering of the oil price, but it's not ideal for them. The whole reason they're pursuing economic diversification in the first place is because the low oil price shook the very foundations of their economy. It follows, therefore, that a high oil price is good for them. There is no economic benefit for them in bringing the oil price down. They are only doing it to appease Trump. And this is why the OPEC nations are very unhappy with this. So when Iran is complaining and saying that, you know, you can't stop our oil exports, you can't keep bringing the price down because of our economy, this resonates a lot with OPEC countries and with the EU. Therefore, I think Iran still has many cards to play before it will even have to even consider blocking the Hormuz Strait or blocking the oil exports from the Gulf.
Hamid Mousavi, what do you make of what you heard just then? To what extent is Iran playing into the hands of the Trump administration with this threat, in that ultimately it could be providing an excuse for military action or even war?
Yes, well, I would first of all say that Iran has not explicitly threatened to shut the Strait of Hormuz. What Rouhani said, and I'm quoting in Switzerland, he said that if Iran cannot export its oil, then it doesn't make sense for the region to be able to do so. Now, that is, of course, an implicit threat. Nevertheless, I just want to make clear that in this stage, at least, Iran has not explicitly threatened to shut the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the reason Iran is making such threats is that from the Iranian perspective, Iran has done all of its obligations under the nuclear deal and is actually continuing to do so even right now. Nevertheless, the Trump administration decided to leave the nuclear deal, and because of all the pressures and sanctions, the Iranian currency has actually lost more than half of its value in the past 4 months. So the Trump administration is trying to strangle the Iranian economy, and essentially what Rouhani is saying is that you cannot expect to keep on doing this and Iran to do nothing. Up to now, Iran has actually shown a lot of restraint. Even though the Americans decided to leave the deal, Iran is at least attempting to continue the deal with the Europeans. Nevertheless, the Trump administration is trying to make that very difficult, and we'll have to wait and see to actually see what the Europeans will be able to do.
Mamdouh Salameh, is Iran to be applauded for standing up to the Trump administration here by issuing a threat, however veiled, like this, or do you think it's panicking?
No, it is not panicking. Iran is an independent country, and every independent country has the legal right to defend its interests. The forthcoming American sanctions against Iran are considered a war declaration, economic and trade war declaration against Iran. And Iran has the right to defend itself. When it says that if it is prevented from exporting its own oil, it will prevent others from benefiting from their exports. Now, that was taken as a threat to close the Strait of Hormuz. And that threat should be taken seriously, because closing it doesn't mean physically closing it. It means mining it with the hope that one tanker will hit a mine and that will frighten other tankers from coming to the Gulf, or by an Iranian threat to damage a tanker or some tankers, which will prevent tankers from around the world from coming to the Gulf area across the Strait of Hormuz, and thus preventing oil supplies coming out. it will have the same effect on oil prices by raising oil prices possibly to $120, $130 during the crisis. But of course, prices will go back to normal afterwards. So the threat should be taken seriously, and there are other methods Iran can use. Remember that there are sabotage methods which Iran can use, and Saudi Arabia has the biggest oil installations in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia on the Gulf. So any sabotage, particularly in Ras Al Noura, the biggest loading terminal in the world, would impact very effectively on Saudi exports. To add to that, remember that most of the Gulf countries have no alternative but to use the Strait of Hormuz, with the exception of the United Arab Emirates, which has built 3 years ago its own oil pipeline from Abu Dhabi to Fujairah, thus bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. All the others have to pass with their export through the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia has a bit of leeway in having an oil pipeline from the eastern part to Yanbu on the Red Sea, which was built with Iraqi money during the Iraq-Iran war. It had a capacity of 2 million barrels a day, but I understand that the Saudis quietly increased the capacity to 4 million. That will still be around 50% or less of Saudi oil exports. So all in all, the threat should be taken seriously, and countries of the world should try to deal with the crisis in a tactful and peaceful and wise way.
OK, tactful, peaceful and wise. Sami, Hamdi, are we going to get that sort of response, do you think, from any of the countries involved here? What do you make of Washington's warnings to other nations to stop imports of Iranian oil when US sanctions against Iran go into effect in November, or else? That's bullying tactics, isn't it?
It is bullying tactics, and Trump is an expert at these bullying tactics. However, what is interesting is that we now live in an age where US is no longer the sole hegemon of the world. You have the likes of China and Russia standing up to US foreign policy. That's not implying that they are knights in shining armor, but it's the reality that there is more of a power equilibrium being established in the world. The reason why I say this is because what's very interesting is that India has already stated that it is more inclined not to obey the sanctions on Iran. China itself has indicated that it may not accept these sanctions on Iran. The EU is contemplating how to save the nuclear deal. France in particular wants Airbus to benefit from its deals with Iran and is desperately seeking some sort of arrangement. Washington is aware of this, and the proof of that is that Trump has recently announced that he will assess the sanctions case on a case-by-case basis, suggesting that there is room for leeway for opening up certain sectors or preventing certain sectors from being subject to sanctions. Trump should be well aware, perhaps he is well aware, or at least his policy advisors will be well aware, that this time implementing the sanctions will be far more difficult, because the world jumped on the Iran nuclear deal. It sped to sign agreements with Iran, and now all of a sudden it's being told it's not allowed to implement them. So I think Washington is in a very difficult position when it comes to Iran in terms of trying to keep the line of allies in check. And as I said earlier, remember, he's made a very, very big problem with the EU. I mean, let's look at the Dutch Prime Minister's visit to Washington, whereby Trump said, you know, this is just a problem and we'll sort it out. And the Dutch Prime Minister rebuked him in front of the reporters, something that's perhaps, some would say, unprecedented to be done in the White House in such a manner, suggesting there are very deep divisions. So even if Trump wants to implement sanctions on Iran, I don't think countries are going to rush to obey these particular sanctions, and I don't think the US will necessarily have the clout it once had to enforce those sanctions on the likes of China, on the EU, and on Russia and on India.
Hamid Mousavi, as we said at the beginning of the programme, foreign ministers from France, Germany, Britain, China and Russia are meeting with Iranian officials in Vienna on Friday. How key are the responses of European states in particular to these threats and counter-threats, those who vowed to stay in the Iran nuclear deal in particular?
I think it's very important. I think Iran's reaction will very much depend on how the Europeans decide to go forward. The EU is supposed to give Iran a so-called package on Friday, and Iran will assess whether Iran will stay in the deal or not. We have to remember that when Donald Trump decided to leave the deal, the Rouhani government came under a lot of criticism domestically within Iran, because prior to Trump leaving the deal, Rouhani had actually threatened that if the United States withdraws, then Iran would also withdraw. And that's not something Iran has done, of course. So Iran is really waiting to see what the Europeans will do, whether they will be able to keep at least, hopefully, a major part of the deal. The problem here is that Donald Trump did not only decide that he wants to withdraw from the deal, but essentially that he wants to kill the deal. So he's implementing all these sanctions, maybe from his part, to hope that Iran would withdraw regardless of the Europeans. And I think this package will really much depend on what Iran's reaction will very much depend on what the Europeans will do on Friday.
Mamdouh Salameh, President Trump has been tweeting criticism of OPEC members, saying that they must reduce prices and that the US defends them for very little dollars. What do you make of that? Does President Trump misunderstand how the oil market works?
Absolutely spot on. He doesn't understand the machinations of the global oil market. A case in point is he tweeted that Saudi Arabia can add 2 million barrels a day. He got mixed up between spare capacity and ability to produce oil on the spot. So he is, to some extent, not au fait with the economics of oil. Furthermore, he is talking and putting pressure on OPEC to reduce prices. But he forgets that the United States has been manipulating oil prices all these 3 years through the petrodollar, when it raises the value of the dollar or reduces it, and through claims about how greatly increasing U.S. shale oil production, in addition to claims about increases on crude and product inventories in the United States. All of them intended as a ploy to depress oil prices. But he failed completely because the global oil market has seen through it. Talking of importance is that since the sanctions in 2015, the global oil market has changed completely. In 26th of March this year, China launched the petro-yuan. And in the first 2 hours of its launching, it has overtaken the Brent exchange. And now it accounts for 12% of the total global oil market, estimated at 14 trillion. Before the end of the year, it will hit 50%, and it will undermine the petrodollar completely. And that's why I have been saying frequently that sanctions on Iran will not cost it a single barrel of oil loss. The reason the 2015 sanctions before 2015 succeeded is for 2 reasons. The European Union then imposed sanctions on any companies, insurance companies or cargo companies transporting Iran's oil export. The European Union is not going to do that now, and they announced they will comply with the nuclear agreement, and they will continue to buy Iranian oil export. As for U.S. sanctions on banking and preventing Iran, like in 2015, from getting payment for its oil exports in dollar, Iran doesn't need that, because all oil exports, and that's the majority of its oil exports, go to China. It will be paid by the petro-yuan, which is supported by gold. It will be paid by euro from the European Union and by barter trade with Russia, Turkey, and India.
All right, Sami Hamdi, what do you make of what you heard just there? You talked about the US's diminishing influence and that Russia, China, likely to ignore this threat of US sanctions if they continue to buy Iranian oil. What other nations might ignore that? Japan, for instance, which has warned that its economy would be severely hit if it couldn't continue to import Iranian oil. What about the European nations? Are they going to ride out this threat from Donald Trump?
I think, Adrian, to be honest, it's true that the nations are not very receptive of Trump's sanctions. However, we should also remember that there is a very great danger here in the way that we are discussing, that we paint Iran as a victim of the machinations of the US. Remember the reason why many countries in the Gulf are lobbying the US to be harsh on Iran. It is because Iran's foreign policy has irked and disturbed many nations in the region. Iran has numerous militias in Iraq. It is heavily involved in Syria in propping up the Assad regime. And it has Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has a gun pointed towards the Lebanese government. We have to remember that Iran is not a victim in this region, and that the chapter that we see today with regards to the oil is only one chapter of a big, long book of relationship between Iran, the Gulf, and the US. Let's also not forget Iranian involvement in Yemen. Iran seems today like it's a victim. And it's true, perhaps in this it may well have been wronged. But let us not give the impression that this has emerged from nothing. It is more than just an issue of oil price. It is also about curbing Iranian activity in Iraq, for example. In Iraq, it is dominated by Iranian influence. The US are now second to Iran in Iraq. You can see now in the way government negotiations are taking place in Iraq. General Qasem Soleimani of the Quds Force in Iran is the one conducting negotiations between the various Shiite parties to ensure a pro-Iran majority government. This is why there are all these attempts in order to curb Iran's capabilities in the region itself. So whilst I agree today that perhaps Iran is being hard done with regards to its oil exports, while I agree that Trump is being very harsh on Iran, and while I agree that Trump is pursuing these policies for Machiavellian reasons, let us not be hoodwinked by what Iran is doing in the region. This does not suggest that Saudi and the UAE are good parties or that they are victims or the like. The reality is, in this very geopolitical game being played in the region, Iran is a major player. Nobody can deny that. Even during sanctions, it was still able to pursue an aggressive foreign policy, and it is still pursuing an aggressive foreign policy despite its economic situation, despite its political situation. So we should be very much aware. Nations want to deal with Iran. That's very much true. But they want to deal with Iran because they know also that Iran remains a very strong country with significant influence in the region.
Hamid Mousavi, we're running out of time here. What do you make of what you've just heard there? Iran has irked and disturbed its neighbours. It's not a victim here. To a certain extent, it's brought this situation upon itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would actually say that the major source of instability in the region has not been Iran. Rather, it's been the United States and Israel. Let's remember that a lot of the instability in the Middle East was created out of the illegal war of 2003 when the United States decided to invade Iraq. Yes, Iran does have influence in Iraq, but we have to remember that Iraq is Iran's neighbor and over 60% Shia. I mean, we never talk about the United States having influence in Canada, because we see it as somehow natural. So why would Iran's influence in Iraq in terms of international relations be this anomaly? Rather, we should be talking about the United States bullying the countries in the region. Yep. And also, we have to remember that Iran does not have bad relationship with everyone, rather only with Saudi Arabia, Israel, and perhaps the UAE.
All right, Sami, I know that you want to come in there. Can you give me a 10-second answer?
No, I was just saying the comparison with America and Iran and Canada is wrong, because America has no militias in Canada. Iran's interference is not that of a neighborly, it's that of almost a colonizer.
I'm sorry, we could go on. Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're right out of time. We're going to have to stop there. Many thanks indeed. Mamdouh Salameh, Hamid Mousavi and Sami Hamdi, thank you as always for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, please join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And don't forget, you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here. See you again. Bye for now.